Mark Rogers TV joining you just after the initial release of the first college football rankings. Alabama is number 1 according to the College Football Playoff Committee. Clemson 2, Michigan 3, and Texas A&M at number 4. Here are my thoughts, and I would like to hear from you. Alabama should not be number 1. Clemson should be 1, and Alabama 2. I believe the Crimson Tide to be the best football team in the country, and they have played the best. They have not beaten the best opponents, though. Both teams are, of course, undefeated. Clemson has wins over a number 9 Auburn team, number 7 Louisville, and against Florida State as well. Bama cannot match those 3 wins. They've got Texas A&M, they've got Tennessee, they've got USC, Ole Miss. Yes, those are 4 good wins, but obviously much lost on the Rebels in recent weeks. And Clemson should have it over Alabama at this point. That's not a real major concern, of course. If those teams win out or even lose one game and win their conferences, they should be in great shape. Michigan at number 3 at 8-0. The Wolverines play the better part of their schedule late, specifically against Ohio State. Maryland could present a bit of a challenge. And a trip to Iowa for Michigan, and that would a loss there could create an interesting scenario on the final weekend that we will get to in just a minute. Michigan at number 3. All right, the real controversy here is Texas A&M at 4, Washington at 5. Disrespect possibly to the Pac-12. The Pac-12 comes in with 4 teams ranked in the top 25 in the rankings, but Washington the only viable contender, and that's pretty obvious from the way the season has played out to date. The Pac-12 is very deep, very even, but not top-heavy. Therefore, you're not going to have many contenders, and right now we just have 1, and that's Washington. Okay, my thought is that if Washington wins out, regardless of what Texas A&M does in closing out the season, and that would include a big win over LSU at the end of the campaign, Washington would have to go to the College Football Playoff as an undefeated team and the Pac-12 champion. The dicey and difficult decision is if Washington loses once and Texas A&M is 11-1 with a 1 loss to the number 1 team in the country, Alabama, on the road, a game in which they led 14-13 in the third quarter and lost decidedly but did not get blown out in any way. Does that weigh more heavily than Washington winning the Pac-12, losing a game? So they're going to lose a game against a team that's not that highly regarded. They would lose to a USC, possibly to a Utah in the Pac-12 championship game. Obviously, that would mean they wouldn't win the Pac-12. But let's say Washington State, who is at number 25 with 2 losses right now. That would be a difficult decision, but I would opt for the Pac-12 champion to go over an SEC runner-up that did not even make the SEC championship game. I do believe that the SEC Western Division, despite the issues with Mississippi State and Ole Miss in particular, and Arkansas maybe not being quite as good as we thought, is still the best division in college football. We've seen life from LSU in recent weeks. Alabama's the best team in the land. Texas A&M is extremely good. And what about that Auburn resurgence? All right, so that's my thought there. Interesting scenario. If the Pac-12 champion, Washington, loses 1 game and is matched up against the Texas A&M team that's 11-1, considering that schedule, with a win against UCLA as well, that would be an interesting call, that I will make. That won't matter. It only matters what the College Football Playoff Committee thinks, but one that I will make at that time. But I would lean toward the Pac-12 champion with 1 loss. Ohio State sits best as the best opportunity outside the top 5, not just because of the place that they stand at number 6, but because of the opportunity. The loss is to a number 12 team in the nation right now, Penn State. That was on the road. That was an extremely close game. They've got Michigan. They've got everything in front of them. The Michigan game, the final game of the season. Of course, Ohio State would most likely, depending on a difficult scenario that we would lay out for you here, Ohio State goes on to the Big Ten championship game, wins 12-1. As the Big Ten champion, they're going to get in with that record. Louisville's an interesting case. Of course, they could play out a similar scenario to Texas A&M where they beat everyone in their conference. They look mighty impressive. They only lose to Clemson, and it was an extremely close game. So Texas A&M losing decidedly at Alabama, but Louisville losing on the final possession at Clemson would have a real argument. But Louisville at number 7 right now, not going to help themselves down the stretch against lesser division foes in the ACC in a game against Houston, who's not as good as we thought they were, and Kentucky. Wisconsin at number 8, you would think that they're out of the mix with the 2 losses, but they are in great shape to win the Western Division, get a crack at a Ohio State or Michigan, and who knows if the chips fall elsewhere, Wisconsin could play its way back into it. Maybe the most interesting scenario involves the Auburn Tigers. It's 6-2, 1-2 to start. They're on a 5-game winning streak. They've beaten the likes of LSU in recent weeks, demolished Arkansas, beat Ole Miss, and consider the 2 losses are against Texas A&M, the number 4 team, and the number 1 team, 19-13. Auburn's in great shape. Is it an easy path? No. They've got to play Alabama at the end, and they still have a loss to Texas A&M. So it's almost like an Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State scenario in the SEC Western Division if those teams are able to come back, meaning Auburn, and beat Alabama to create a 3-way tie there. Of course, Texas A&M would have the tiebreaker over Alabama or over Auburn head-to-head, and then the 3-way would come down to a college football playoff committee ranking and a common opponent scenario. All right, Nebraska's at number 10. I think the Huskers are in great shape. Do I think they're a good enough football team to make the playoff? No. But we did see something out of Nebraska at Madison last weekend that leads us to believe that they might compete against a struggling Ohio State offense this weekend. Nebraska at Ohio State. If the Huskers can get off the deck, we'll see if they can play 2 really good games on the road back-to-back. We haven't seen that out of a Nebraska team in quite some time. But take the Nebraska effort last week. If they duplicate that in Columbus, they've got a shot to defeat the Buckeyes. If Nebraska closes out with all wins, they will go to the Big Ten championship game and play the likes of Michigan or Penn State, most likely Michigan, with Ohio State going down to Nebraska. Nebraska, Michigan, and what a game that would be with Nebraska right in line to win a championship. So nobody talking Nebraska right now, but they've got a clear path to get to the college football playoff, unlike a number of teams ahead of them, i.e. Ohio State, Louisville, Wisconsin. They have the clear path. And even Auburn, a spot ahead of Nebraska, needs some help. People are talking about Florida. Of course, they don't look like a college football playoff team right now, but it's 6-1 with a clear path to get to the division championship. And Atlanta in a matchup with Alabama could, of course, play their way right into it. They'll have a date with Florida State. That means nothing for the SEC, but means everything at that point if they're sitting at 9-1 against Florida State to get to the SEC title game and a college football playoff. Penn State's created an interesting scenario because they're 6-2. They're pretty highly regarded at number 12. The committee has stated in the past that they look toward momentum and quality play at the back end of the schedule, and Penn State certainly has done that to date. They're playing their best football right now. Penn State's schedule is easy, and if they get help from Iowa defeating Michigan, Iowa defeats Michigan in a few weeks at Iowa City, then a 3-way tie goes Penn State's way, a 2-way tie against Ohio State because the Buckeyes, having defeated Michigan, create the 2-way tie. Penn State goes to the Big Ten championship game. Let's say at 10-2, Penn State then wins the Big Ten title game. They're 11-2, and they have just defeated Wisconsin or Nebraska, either one ranked in the top 10 in the country. They would have a play and a say into this as well, and maybe that creates a difficult situation for Washington in particular. LSU, much like Auburn, it's all right in front of them. They do have a more difficult schedule because they have yet to play Texas A&M. So LSU has proven less than Auburn at this point, but they do have Alabama coming up this week, and Texas A&M are the 2 difficult games, and of course Florida as well. People are talking about Oklahoma. They've lost 2 games, both out of conference, and they were not close games. Had they played Ohio State and Houston to the wire, that would be a difficult scenario to play out. But even then, it could be argued that Oklahoma had righted the ship, swept the Big 12 9-0, but getting blown out against Ohio State and being manhandled in the fourth quarter against Houston, especially with the Cougars playing the way they are. Oklahoma, I believe, has no shot in this. Colorado's an interesting wild card at number 15. because they could play their way into the Pac-12 championship game, defeat possibly an undefeated Washington team, and sit there at 11-2. Don't think that's going to happen. Remember, my preseason picks were Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Washington. Still very much in play right there. All right. This will get more interesting as we go. Obviously, we'll now get to see how the committee rates wins and losses going forward. We know right now that they value Texas A&M's schedule over Washington's first place standing and undefeated record in the Pac-12. We know that they still really like Ohio State, that they value Auburn's record and their resume against a difficult schedule, as they do Wisconsin and Penn State, of course, given a whole lot of credit for defeating Ohio State, because that's really Penn State's big win. Other than that, blown out by Michigan, lost to a mediocre Pitt team at 5-3, and with some marginal wins against the likes of Maryland and other teams. All right, those are my thoughts on the initial college football playoff rankings. I'll have much more to say as this unfolds, and we can then see how the committee ranks wins and losses going forward. Need to hear from you now on Mark Rogers TV.